It's got adventure, it's got mystery, and it's got swashbuckling pirates singing a catchy tune. That's right, it's Pirates of the Caribbean, one of the Disneyland classics known around the world. The story began in the year 1957 as Walt Disney put Imagineer Sam McKim in charge of designing a New Orleans-themed area. Disneyland had a New Orleans area since opening day in 1955. In Frontierland is an area called New Orleans Street. Today, this is where the restaurant Riverbell Terrace lies. But these buildings weren't enough for Walt. He wanted something fully immersive. He took his family and a few Imagineers on a trip to New Orleans, Louisiana, in order to analyze and document the historic French Quarter, to replicate a bit of it at Disneyland. The plan for the park was to expand the area by moving the Disneyland railroad tracks about 100 feet further to the west. Then the area they called Magnolia Gardens, with the Disneyland gazebo, would be entirely rebuilt. And so, in 1961, construction walls went up around this whole area, closing off the Disneyland Railroad. The gazebo was donated to Rogers Gardens in Newport Beach, California, where it sits to this very day next to the farmhouse. Walt brought animator Marc Davis to Imagineering, impressed with his ideas on improving Disneyland. One of Marc's first assignments as a newly dubbed Imagineer was to help design the pirate wax museum that was going to be called the Rogues Gallery. While Imagineer Herb Ryman and his team went to work designing New Orleans Square, it was Marc Davis, Claude Coates, Sam McKim, and several others who started the initial designs of the Rogues Gallery. New Orleans Square would sit atop a massive basement designed for this walkthrough attraction in order to save on space. This meant that the shops and eateries of New Orleans Square were confined to a walkable space barely 3 acres in size. The basement dugout of the Rogues Gallery was about 20 feet below the elevation of the rest of New Orleans Square. This gave enough room for some high ceilings, tall enough to fit sets built with a technique called forced perspective. You may have wondered how the name of the attraction went from Rogues Gallery to Pirates of the Caribbean. Marc Davis recalled his first meeting with Walt about the project. "Marc, there's something I'd like to do. I'd like to do an attraction on pirates. Maybe Pirates of the Caribbean." And those 4 words had a certain ring to it, which stayed with Marc all through the planning stages. The wax museum idea was already having problems, mainly capacity issues, and Walt wasn't sure that the stationary figures were all that exciting. He had brought an idea to the Imagineers about making the human figures move in the same way they had animated the critters on the Jungle Cruise, but the only problem with that was the simplistic animation of such figures would be too unrealistic. However, everything changed in 1963 with the opening of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. The birds, flowers, tiki gods, and show elements all came to life thanks to space-age technology, or more specifically, the harnessed power of magnetic recording tape. Scientists who needed to program unmanned rockets or even guided missiles needed the guidance systems to run without the aid of a person on board. The solution was to design all the guiding systems to activate when cued by a pulse of ultrasound, which would trigger solenoids that would flip switches to various functions. The Imagineers at WED used this technology for programming the Tiki Room and for programming the various animatronics in their New York World's Fair attractions, though they discovered a major flaw with the technology. For one, the attractions designed for the fair required the tapes to be running at all times, with virtually no downtime to reset them. Imagineers had to design a master tape machine with 2 tapes, both of them with identical programming. The idea was that once one of the tapes came to the end of the reel, an ultrasound cue was placed at a specific part of the reel, which triggered the next reel to start playing. As the next reel was running the show, the previous reel would then rewind itself back to the starting point, and the whole process would repeat itself over and over again. With the success of the first lifelike audio animatronic figure Abraham Lincoln, designed to give a speech at the 1964 New York World's Fair, the artists at WED decided that Pirates of the Caribbean wouldn't be a wax museum, but rather a walk-through show where animatronic pirates acted out scenes. Marc Davis did some research to present the pirates as realistically as possible, but was disappointed to find out that most pirates weren't these interesting characters people always thought of. There were hardly any pirate battles. Mostly they were just petty thieves who usually died of all kinds of diseases. That's when Marc decided that he would maintain the image of the pirate stereotype, but poke fun at the idea of it. To soften the heavy themes of fighting and looting, he'd add comedic gags to lighten the mood. Unfortunately, Mark got the sense that Walt was no longer keen on the pirate attraction being a walkthrough. With the great reception of the new ride technology at the fair, it seemed Walt was beginning to imagine Pirates of the Caribbean as a ride. Park operations manager Dick Nunes, who was often jokingly referred to by Imagineers as hop-along capacity, had objected to the idea of the attraction as a walkthrough. He reminded Walt that the new technologies developed for the World's Fair were just the thing Disneyland needed. With popular new attractions come more crowds, and any rides developed for Disneyland thereafter must be designed for large capacity. Nunes stated that the pirates sailed on boats. The pirate attraction should be a boat ride. Walt considered the new water flume technology developed for It's a Small World, and then he simply responded, "Nunes, you're gonna get your boat ride." Imagineer Don Edgren hastily went to work looking at the measurements of the basement already dug into New Orleans Square, trying to figure out a possible layout for the ride. When Don and his team came back to Walt to inform him that the basement simply wasn't large enough to house the entirety of any boat ride, Walt simply told them to make it happen. The Imagineers decided that the basement of New Orleans Square would be used for the waterfalls that brought guests down below ground, but they would need to dig a tunnel underneath the railroad to get the passengers into the main show building where most of the ride scenes would take place. Walt agreed to the plan and sent Bob Gurr to talk with Disneyland's ride manufacturer Aero Development to have them alter the designs of their boat flume to make them capable of sliding down waterfalls and going up chain lifts. Meanwhile, at Disneyland, workers had to tear up all the steel that had previously been laid to create the basement and ground floor of New Orleans Square, because the layout of the steel was no longer compatible with the new ride design. To bring the boats from the basement to the show building outside, they dug a channel about 30 feet wide, and it crossed underneath the rerouted Disneyland Railroad and out into a large soundstage-like show building outside the park's new boundary. This meant that with two separate show buildings, the pirate ride finally had enough space for all the designs being dreamed up at WED. The building outside the park had to be constructed in a triangular shape because it was butted up against the Disneyland monorail beamway, and Imagineers didn't want to fight the accountants for more money to relocate the monorail path. Eventually, the monorail path was rerouted, but that was for the addition of the Indiana Jones adventure in the year 1995. With Mark Davis and Claude Coates working on the new show scenes for the ride, Walt brought in storyboard sketch artist Xavier Atencio and asked him to write the script and dialogue for the show. X had never been a show writer before, but Walt had a keen sense for discovering people's hidden talents. It turned out that X would create a script so iconic that many of the lines that he wrote would be remembered by generations of park goers. X had also found that to tie everything together, there had to be a song. And with Walt's approval, X penned lyrics for the ride in the style of a pirate-themed drinking song. When he read the words of "Yo ho, a pirate's life for me," Walt was pleased and told him to get his studio composer George Bruns to do the music for it. And so the famous pirate song was born, and it would be sung by the Mellomen Group, who recorded a few songs for Disney movies such as Alice in Wonderland and Lady and the Tramp. Voices for the ride utilized a small group of veteran voiceover artists. Most notable of this list were actors such as J. Pat O'Malley and Paul Frees. These two men alone created more than half of the voices on the ride. Paul Frees, of course, chanted the famous line, "Dead men tell no tales," as well as providing the original voice of the pirate auctioneer before it was re-recorded in 2018. Other voices on the ride were sometimes supplied by Imagineers. X. Atencio himself voiced the skull over the waterfall.
He comes seeking adventure and salty old pirates, eh? Sure, you've come to the proper place.
He also provided the voice of the drunken pirate with the hairy leg, belting out the lyrics of yo ho in an off-key manner. To bring Mark Davis's characters from the page into the third dimension, master sculptor Blaine Gibson brought all the characters to life in clay maquettes. Walt often popped in on the Imagineers to see their progress, and he would comment here and there on how things could be done or improved. One day, he watched Blaine sculpting the figure of the redhead lifting up the corner of her dress for the pirates to see. Walt stopped and said, "Don't get too sexy with that, Blaine. This is Disneyland." The maquettes were brought to Fred Yerger's model department, where Harriet Burns, Leota Toombs, and others on the team painted them all. and with the help of Wathel Rogers and Colin Campbell, the 5 of them designed a massive scale model of the whole ride, built close to eye level so that Walt and other designers could get a guest eye view of what the show would look like from the perspective of being in the boats. While the actual audio animatronic figures were being built, Walt asked Mark Davis's wife, Alice, to design and create all the costumes for each of the animatronic figures. This was no easy job. Most of the figures were either bolted to the floor or to random props and designed in odd postures and positions. How do you put a shoe on a pirate who can't lift his foot off the floor? How do you put a shirt on a pirate whose arm is bolted to a lamppost? She had to use innovative techniques of carefully placed snaps, buttons and zippers, and Velcro to get the clothing on the pirates. Some clothing pieces were designed in several parts and put together on the animatronic like assembling a puzzle. Designing costumes for the animated figures was nothing like costumes for people. These figures wear away the fabric in areas that people never would, or sometimes the clothing was the only thing giving shape to a body part, so it had to be designed to hold that shape. The redhead, for example, was nothing but a narrow pole from her hips to her bosoms. So Alice had to create a corset for her that maintained the shape of her body and didn't slide around on that metal tube. With the main elements of the ride taking place beyond the berm of the park, Imagineers were faced with figuring out what to put in the basement below the Blue Bayou. You see, dropping the boats down the waterfalls was necessary to get them low enough that they could pass underneath the Disneyland Railroad. So the waterfalls were simply there because they had to be. So what do they put around the waterfalls to occupy the space and make it part of the story? Walt simply told them, I don't know, put some caves down there or something. Fred Yerger and Claude Coates went to work filling the grotto with scenes depicting pirate skeletons spending eternity enjoying their riches, which they so readily gave their lives to protect. In 1965, show scenes for the ride were being put together as life-size mock-ups on the sound stages at WED and the Disney studio. Walt got to enjoy the pirate auction scene as he walked around the sets. He thought the mock-ups were fantastic, but Exitensia was worried that with all the pirates talking at once, the building would sound too cluttered with voices. Walt responded, "Don't worry about it, it's like a cocktail party. People will tune into a conversation over here and then a conversation over there. Each time the guests come through, they'll hear something completely different. That'll bring them back time and again." Despite Pirates of the Caribbean still under construction and the Haunted Mansion project being moved to the back burner, Walt Disney opened New Orleans Square on July 24, 1966. Everything was moving along at Disneyland with projects happening all around. On the other side of the park, Tomorrowland was in the middle of a major upgrade and overhaul, and the company itself was preparing plans for a major project in Florida that Walt simply called Disney World. Amid all the chaos, Walt was hiding a secret from his Imagineers. In October 1966, Walt Disney was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had undergone surgery to remove it, but when his health continued to fail, his doctors realized that the surgery had come too late. Though the family knew of his condition, Walt preferred not to speak about it to his employees, especially not the Imagineers. Mark Davis recalled that after not seeing Walt around for a while, he suddenly showed up to inspect Mark's progress. His eyes were sunken and his appearance was gaunt, Mark said. He listened to me give him the rundown. After I was done, he said, "That's good." And as usual, he began to stroll out of my office. He usually would leave with a cheery wave and say, "See you later." But this time he stopped at the doorway. He turned to look at me and he said, "Goodbye, Mark." Then he left. I was shocked because he never used to say goodbye. It was always, "See you later." That was the last time I ever saw him. Walt Disney died on December 15, 1966, at the age of 65. Without a leader or the guiding force of creativity that he provided, everyone in the company was shaken to the core. Everything that had happened in the movies and the parks always had to go through Walt first and get his input. Who could possibly fill his shoes? What would happen to the company? What would happen to their jobs? Walt Disney was president of his company, but he did not run it alone. The CEO was his older brother, Roy Oliver Disney, who at the age of 73 was planning to retire, but Walt had previously convinced him to stay until Disney World was completed. After Walt died, Roy sent out a memo to everyone at Walt Disney Productions. It read, "The death of Walt Disney is a loss to all the people of the world. His entertainment was an international language. There is no way to replace Walt Disney. He was an extraordinary man. All of the plans for the future that Walt had begun will continue to move ahead. That is the way Walt wanted it to be." With Walt gone, he had put aside all notions of retirement and dedicated the rest of his life to completing the projects his little brother had left behind. He would see Pirates of the Caribbean through to the grand opening. With most of the ride sets and animatronics ready, it was time to start shipping things out to Anaheim. Everything was boxed up and loaded onto trucks. Imagineer Fred Yerger was put in charge of overseeing the installation of the show and ensuring the completion of the final phase. Ride testing was soon underway, and the kinks had to be ironed out. Pirates of the Caribbean held its soft opening for park guests on March 18, 1967, but it officially debuted a month later on April 19th. The press opening was grand. They loaded reporters and photographers onto the sailing ship Columbia, and then they sailed around the rivers of America, effectively hijacking the press. When the ship pulled back into port, the pirates, captained by Wally Bogue, star of the Golden Horseshoe Revue, led everyone to the entrance of Pirates of the Caribbean. And with a ceremonial swing of a battering ram in true pirate style, they busted down the doors to the entrance and revealed to the public an attraction that would represent the very pinnacle of Disney creativity and innovation. For decades, Pirates of the Caribbean would be the stick against which all Disney attractions would be measured. At the entrance to the attraction, here guests enter an old Spanish manor just off of Royal Street in New Orleans Square. Originally, the entrance was just flat pavement that sloped downwards from the building towards the rivers of America. The massive queues that would form out front would zigzag all the way down to the water's edge, completely bottlenecking the area. So for the attraction's 20th anniversary in 1987, the entire front area was redone to include a forecourt at the river level, with an elevated walkway built so guests could get to and from Adventureland. When you enter the building, you are greeted with an unusual sight, an elevated canal with boats floating by, and in the center is a sandbar with a treasure map and a squawking parrot. It features a map of Isla Tesoro, the name of the Spanish island your boats travel through during the ride, as well as a replacement of the original animatronic parrot with Mr. Cotton's parrot from the movie franchise. Once you follow the canal through the backside of the manor, you find yourself in the moonlit bayou, standing on Lafitte's Landing, named after the infamous pirate Jean Lafitte. The boats you see today on the attraction are technically the third generation of boats used on Pirates of the Caribbean. The original boats from 1967 were manufactured by Aero Development and appeared similar to the original boats on It's a Small World. However, these boats would go down waterfalls and up chain lifts. Their shape would need to incorporate shear, which is a technical term for the type of upwards curve at both ends of the boat. Also, the guide wheels of the boats would need to be located on the sides, and a set of wheels underneath the boats prevents them from bottoming out and getting stuck at various points on the course. The pirate boats would need a more robust skeleton of steel framework so they could hold together when cresting a hill or being dragged up a lift. Lastly, the original boats were designed to have 5 rows, just like their counterparts in Fantasyland. For the ride's 20th anniversary in 1987, the original boats from the 60s were stripped down to their metal frame. Imagineers squeezed in an extra row by rearranging the seating and eliminating the unused space on the bow and stern. This design successfully increased the capacity of each boat from 20 passengers to 23. Between 2003 and 2005, the boats were sent out one by one for repainting to remove the bright colors and make the boats appear to be made of wood. But around the year 2015, after 28 years, they were starting to show signs of stress, particularly because passengers were getting heavier every year. Disney sent the fleet of boats to be modified. They returned in 2016 with a stronger steel frame and new fiberglass, and the seats were made from plastic with taller backs and no metal handrails except for the one on the bow. The new boats also featured larger bumpers to better cushion impacts with other boats. Once the boats launched from the landing, they float along the blue bayou. The idea here was that the bayou would set the mood for the attraction. The Blue Bayou restaurant would offer a high-end dining experience, the first of its kind at Disneyland. The boat glides through canals underneath New Orleans Square, past a squatter's shack, and approaches a real-life Jolly Roger, voiced by Imagineer X Atencio. It reminds us to keep our ruddy hands inboard as we prepare for the first of 2 drops. The waterfalls have a 30-degree angle. The first one drops your elevation by 12 feet, while the second drops you a further 8 feet. In the caverns, we see pirate skeletons in the various positions and actions they were the moment they died. Aside from lighting upgrades, the caverns areas haven't changed much. As we continue along the treasure room, we might be convinced it's all real loot. However, most of it is made out of resin, plaster, or clay. At the far end of the treasure room is a massive stone chest, spilling over with jewels. This is the same prop from the 2003 movie, preserved here at Disneyland since 2006. The most memorable scene on the attraction is where the pirate ship, the Wicked Wench, is attacking the fort on the island of Tesoro. Across the way at the fort, the Spanish soldiers who are returning fire were barely added in during the 1997 refurbishment. The scene with the pirate auction is currently still the most controversial change made yet. Originally, this was an auction scene where the best female candidates in town were rounded up to be auctioned off as brides. In 2018, the whole area was altered to show the auctioning of rum and treasure, and the redhead, who was always the star of the scene, is now depicted as a pirate. Today, most of the animatronics in Pirates of the Caribbean are controlled by digital programming on various computers throughout the ride. There's a much more advanced and centralized system at Walt Disney World. But during the creation of the original pirate attraction at Disneyland, Imagineers needed to advance their animatronic technology. The first humanoid audio animatronic that Disney had built was Abraham Lincoln, which was featured in a show at the 1964 New York World's Fair. Unfortunately, their process of programming the animatronic by re-recording ultrasound cues on tape was flawed. Lincoln would malfunction, sometimes in spectacular ways.
We had great technical difficulties in getting the character to move properly in New York, and God, it would be going great, and then all of a sudden he would do a great jerk or decide to sit down.
You see, these animatronic figures were moved through the use of hydraulic fluid, which was pressurized at 500 pounds per square inch. If the programming tape had dust on it, or if it was worn out, the programming would be misread, firing the solenoids at incorrect intervals. The solenoids controlled the valves that permitted hydraulic fluid in and out of the various cylinders and actuators in the figure. Lincoln would sometimes make a rude hand gesture at the audience, or his body would jerk violently, causing him to destroy his chair. In one often told story, he blew a hydraulic line in his torso, causing the red fluid to leak through his white shirt. Without pressure in the system, Lincoln fell backwards onto his chair, and the audience was traumatized. One woman claimed they had recreated his assassination. These kinds of accidents must not happen on Pirates of the Caribbean, so the Imagineers devised a way of creating a programming tower that combined analog and digital controls. A cam and lever system was created. By cutting out vinyl discs into unique shapes based on the desired movement, a cam would roll over these shapes, and the computer would interpret the movement as a command that was sent to the valve solenoids. This left very little possibility of error on the part of the programming. And on top of that, Disney never used red hydraulic fluid again, instead switching to clear fluid. Imagineering no longer creates hydraulically powered animatronics anymore. They have completely switched to electric motors, but many of the classic figures in old rides and attractions around the park still operate on hydraulic fluid until the day when funding comes to entirely replace the figure. But with an all-electric animatronic costing around $1 million or more, the replacement of hydraulic figures is slow and gradual. The Burning Town scene features a lot of special effects designed by WED's master of illusions, Yale Gracie. Yale found ways of making fallen lumber look like it was burning as hot embers, mainly by using a translucent material on the outside and hiding staged lighting on the inside. Another very convincing fire effect he designed was by taking sheets of silver mylar cut out into the shape of a fire silhouette and shined lights on it from below. By using a powerful fan, the mylar would shimmer and flutter quickly in the breeze, reflecting the light and imitating a fast-burning flame. Mark Davis recalled, 2 or 3 months after the attraction had opened, there was a fire in the fire scene. It burned up several of the figures. It was the most gruesome thing you've ever seen in your life. The fire had started when one of the fans had failed and the mylar sheet had collapsed onto the stage lights in such a way that it insulated them in their own heat, causing them to ignite. The attraction had to be shuttered, and Imagineering was quickly repairing the damaged animatronics. Alice Davis, his wife and costume designer of the attraction, knew that as a costume designer, you have to have a backup set of costumes. Unfortunately, during construction, the accountants at WED would not approve the money for a second set. Alice recalled, "The show had just opened, and sure enough they had a fire. Dick Irvine asked me how long it would take to replace the costumes. I told him I could have them changed out overnight because I had gone ahead and made a second set. I simply told the bookkeeper that the costumes had cost twice as much as they actually did. He didn't know whether to kiss me or to chew me out for pulling one over on the bean counters." After the fire, Imagineering no longer used mylar for their fire sheets. Instead, they used shiny white satin cloth. It's less convincing, but at least it's safer. As we sail through the canal past the prisoners, we make a left turn and find a building collapsing around us. We make our escape under a low clearance, which is actually part of the main kitchen of New Orleans Square. It's a hallway lined with walk-in refrigerators. The attraction ends with a ride up the lift hill. It's a 21-degree incline with water rushing past you. It's meant to give the idea that you are climbing up a magic waterfall back to the modern day. In actuality, the chain lift is absolutely necessary to bring your boat out of the basement and back to the loading area. In other Pirates of the Caribbean attractions around the world, Imagineers had to incorporate a waterfall drop to imitate the original ride, but they found ways around forcing guests to ride the chain lift back up. So what makes this attraction so special? I could go on and on about how it makes you feel, but I think in this case there is a way to measure it. What makes Pirates of the Caribbean one of the best attractions Disney has ever created is its sheer scale. Going through this ride is an adventure to say the least. With 112,826 square feet of show space, they were able to install a flume stretching 1,838 feet long and filled with over 750,000 gallons of water. This attraction has extremely high ceilings, with the caves 20 feet high, the Blue Bayou 25 feet high, and the main show building boasting 40-foot ceilings tall enough to fit a small sailing ship. It has been the largest ride building Disney had ever constructed up until recent decades. The attraction started out with 55 animatronic animals and a cast of 66 audio animatronic pirates and citizens. At a total cost of an astounding $8 million in 1967, it was the most expensive ride at the time. For what it lacks in storytelling or special effects, it makes up for with its ability to create a sense of immersion and adventure. After Walt Disney died, everyone who worked for him worried about their jobs, and even the company he left behind. Disney stock prices began to drop, park attendance took a small dive, and the creative force that had led them up until this moment was gone. But when Pirates of the Caribbean opened to the public on April 19, 1967, it blew ride attendance records out of the water. With just a few words, Alice Davis said it best: Pirates of the Caribbean literally saved Disneyland. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.